The future of the church, the capital C church, not just my church, not just your church, it's going to look very different in 2024 and frankly beyond because of Generation Z and now Generation Alpha, both waving up, Z into the adult ministry conversation, Alpha into the youth ministry conversation. It makes me wonder if the future is already here. I think it might be. Carey Nieuwhof has been spitting absolute fire recently talking about church trends. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to take his article, Church Trends from 2024, Things You Need to Know, link down below in the description, and talk about it. And so let's jump in, waste no time. Trend number one, he said the boomer church will decline and eventually disappear. This is just basic human psychology. You know, you get it, right? But he said this, he said, since 2020, the boomers have become the least likely demographic to return to church. That's out of post-COVID. 22% of them saying and citing that they've stopped attending church, get this, entirely. Meanwhile, only 16% of millennials have stopped attending, so that's the smallest of the demographics. And I love it if you would give me a subscribe. If you're a millennial, hit a like if you're a Gen Xer, and hey, hit the bell no matter what age demographic you are, because we are going to be dropping all kinds of new stuff. I got a new playlist already in the hopper. We just wrapped up the 2024 Youth Ministry On Demand Masterclass, and now I got one coming at you next week. Excited for it. And if you're on YouTube, you get it early. You get it on Wednesday instead of Thursday in the regular podcast feed. But Nieuwhof goes on to say that 54% of millennials actually attended primarily in person. 65% of boomers say that they only attend in person. And so that's going to be key coming down the pike here in a minute as we look at this trends article about the difference between the hybrid space and the in-person space, right? Unlike boomers, millennials, they don't just track with church while they're in the building. Millennials and Xers, honestly, are quite comfortable with the idea of hybrid church. This is Nieuwhof's blog, and guess what? He has no idea that this podcast exists, but the fact of the matter is he sees it. Just like I feel like I have been seeing it, and I'm not trying to be like, I'm as smart as Carey Nieuwhof, by no means at all. But the dude is calling it, right? And he says, so boomers, for the most part, they've not embraced hybrid church. If you're watching on YouTube, if not, go head to hybridministry.xyz/086 for the show notes. But this graph is going to be on screen. Just click the YouTube link if you do go to your podcast catcher and scrub forward to this part in the episode. But it says, since the COVID-19 pandemic, which of the following most accurately describes your church attendance, either online or in person? This is the percentage of Christians who are attending church pre-COVID-19. And so you'll see that like the highest gap, right, that have stopped attending is actually boomers, which is what most of our churches were built for. And a large majority of millennials, you'll see, and Xers have been attending the same church that they attended pre-COVID. And so there are three kind of main areas of impact with this point. The first one is attendance, right? And one idea that I have in light of that is stop ignoring social media. Our attendance is going to take on a different kind of approach. Millennials and Xers and Gen Z are going to attend church less and less frequently. It doesn't mean they're less committed to your church. It just means they're less committed to being there on a week-to-week basis. We live in a different world. And so if you, as a youth pastor in particular, are ignoring social media or only using social media as an avenue or an outlet to post announcements, you're missing out on an incredible opportunity. I think about it in my own space. I have teenagers who have weekend soccer tournaments and baseball tournaments and things that keep them out on the weekend. It doesn't mean that they're not committed or that they're less committed to our church. It just simply means that they have other obligations. And I know I've worked at churches and on church staffs that say they're not as committed. But if we go hybrid and if we find a way to meet them where they are, which is really what this is all about, they can still consume the things of God. They can still follow him. They can still be connected and attached to our church. You look at this graph here on the screen, weekly church attendance by generation. Millennials are actually the highest out of the pandemic post-COVID. So attendance is area number one that this is going to impact. It's also going to impact volunteering. And thirdly, it's going to impact giving. Carey Nieuwhof goes on to say that open pastors will actually be more well-positioned to reach an open generation. speaking of and talking about Generation Z. Gen Z, statistically speaking, is actually the most spiritually open generation that we've ever actually seen in our history, right? And if you check out the YouTube feed here, you'll see that the spiritual journey of Gen Z, you'll see that they're open. They're much more open to things of God and faith. They believe that there's supernatural or spiritual side to life. 61% compared to 51% of all adults. They've gone through a prolonged period of time where they've significantly doubted their faith. 65% to 49%. 56% say my experiences have led me to deconstruct or take apart my faith of my youth. 56% versus 47%. I'm disillusioned by my experience in the Christian church. 48 to 43%. But I love this line that he has in the blog. It says, a spiritually open generation is a reachable generation. So what are you doing to reach this generation? This generation is laying the groundwork for Gen Alpha, which is right behind them. Youth pastors, Gen Alpha, they're in your youth ministry right now. The oldest ones of them are some of the youngest kids in your youth ministry. So like I said, youth pastors, go hybrid. Check out my ebook, link down in the description. I'll give you step-by-step guide to not only posting on social media, but then also posting your YouTube messages and using that as your bedrock so that everything builds on top of that, which is actually why this next trend, right? I obviously believe this next trend is completely spot on because he says this, the line between digital and in person will blur even more. And he says, take a note from Taylor Swift. Yeah, check this out. He said Taylor Swift is actually a prime example of this. In particular, she's modeling how to have a strong digital presence and drive an intense in-person demand. Her Midnight album released in October of 2022. You can see this graph on the screen. It's absolutely crazy. You will not believe what you're seeing. It says it not only broke streaming records on Spotify, but it simultaneously locked up every position on the Billboard Top 10, and it sold 500,000 physical vinyl albums in a single week. Oftentimes, there's an argument against a hybrid strategy in favor of the in-person experience, like they can't go together. And that's the thing. That is actually the hybrid. I'm like, no, that's not just digital. That's both. That's online and that's in person, and that's putting them together. And pastors, look at the graph. Her in-person ticket sales skyrocketed and went through the roof. So if you can capture the magic of a digital and strong online presence, you can actually bring that into fruition in your in-person experience. And on the converse of that, or the inverse, I don't know, one of those two, the flip side of that, let's go with that. The flip side of that is that once people are attached or connected to your church, you can continue to show up in their life throughout the rest of the week, giving them discipleship resources, Bible study tools, and things that will help them grow in their faith and nurture their walk with God. Number 4, Nieuwhof says that churches that embrace online ministry will start seeing results. You may be out there and being like, I've been trying to do it. I'm not seeing the results. I'm getting frustrated. I'm getting tired. But like I said, we can help, right? I get it. The resources aren't there, and they're likely there for the rest of the church that they're not there, especially for youth ministries, which is why down in the description below, I have YouTube gear for under $100. And this video right here will detail and outline all of it and how you can use it and make it happen. But Carey said that according to Lifeway research, before the pandemic, only 27% of churches offered any live streaming. That's essentially 1 out of 4. However, since that live streaming of services and now post-pandemic, 92% of churches now live stream their services. And so as the world has reopened, the surprising thing is that a number of those churches that were up at the 92%, they've actually throttled back their online services, hoping to drive in-person attendance, right? As if they're competing with one another. And so not only is that a bad strategy, Nieuwhof says, he says it's also incredibly short-sighted. Stick with it. You're going to see the results. Number 5, he says the purpose of the weekend sermon will shift from being an attraction to an anchor. Listen, stop doing this on social media, which is linked down in the description, part of the 2024 Youth Ministry On Demand Masterclass playlist that I just wrapped up last week in the last video. But stop doing these things, right? Stop saying on social media, join us for our new series on Sunday at 9 and 11. Don't miss last Sunday's message, available online, on demand. I can't wait to share a brand new message with you. That's what Nieuwhof is saying. He's like, that's not attraction A. And a lot of times we as pastors, and listen, I get it, pastor, like you've spent time on this sermon. You care about these people and you care and you want them to hear what you have to say. But that's a very on-demand, that's a very cable TV strategy. That's a very like, hey, you can only hear this thing at 9 and 11. And the fact is, like, we don't live in a cable TV society anymore. You don't probably even watch cable TV anymore. The only appointment television that I even have anymore is like live sports. Otherwise, everything else is streaming. And so I think it's much better to start thinking about the real reasons why people come to church, because there are still reasons why people come to church and come to in-person church. Things like community, things like kids and student ministry, things like connection, and an experience that doesn't always translate to online. This all from Nieuwhof's blog. Number 6, he says, content curation will now start to matter as much as content creation. He said the push to online and the changing place of sermons in today's world can leave pastors feeling an unsustainable pressure to produce a non-stop flow of spiritual content. And so as more and more pastors are discovering every year, it's almost impossible to produce top-tier messages week to week that can compete with some of the best that is out and available on the internet. It's not any pressure, right? This was not a pressure from any previous generations, the things that pastors dealt with, but honestly, it can feel like an unsustainable pressure. And so one of the things he says, flip it from content creation to consider curating. Like, how can you gather some of the best sources and then help point and show your people? I mean, even I'm thinking about this weekend, we're doing a workshop for some of our teenagers on how to study the Bible. And if they get on Google, they can find all kinds of different resources, but how do they know if they're reputable or not, right? So we gave them a list. Here are 5 resources that we know, that we trust, and that we say, hey, you can use, right? That's a great example of a way that you can curate the entire World Wide Web and then package it and bring it to your people. Number 7, not to depress anyone, Nieuwhof says, the volunteer crisis will move from acute to chronic. He had 3 reasons for it. Number 1, first, the return to church meant different people returned to church and much slower than I think we all expected. Number 2, more significantly, as trend number 1 outlined at the beginning of the article, boomers are aging out and are the least likely group to return to church. This makes the volunteer backbone of most churches and nonprofit organizations less robust than it used to be, and that's only going to get more challenging, especially as boomers continue to age and ultimately age out. And third and finally, the next generation, primarily millennials and Generation Z, they attend church less and less often, like I said earlier, making it a less frequent thing, meaning they have more options on the weekends, so it gets it harder for them to commit. So we need to be thinking about, as pastors, not only like understanding and realizing there is a volunteer crisis and there is a volunteer problem. How can you shift? We actually talked about it in a video link down below in the description, but we've actually talked about how can you shift your volunteer pitch from we need you to we want to come alongside and support you. We want you to flourish here. We want to watch you experience incredible depth and purpose and live a life on mission. And we believe as a church we can help facilitate that for you. It's really not that big of a shift. Number 8, pastoral burnout will stabilize as pastors embrace their new church. Listen, if you're a pastor here on this podcast, this is good news, because you've seen that over the last several years, pastors have had a high risk for burnout, but there's hope. You're doing a great job. And as this graph highlights, it's starting to stabilize. It's starting to normalize. The newness of all the things from 2020 and beyond is starting to kind of chill out. And there's hope. You can do it, right? There's a light at the end of the tunnel. You know, one of the keys that I have personally found in stabilizing my burnout and making me feel more enticed about continuing on in my job is increasing my time management load, which is actually linked right here on the screen. If you want to check that video out, go ahead and do that. But we're so glad that you checked out this podcast and this episode. Thank you, Carey, for this amazing article. It is spot on, because I believe that we need to make digital discipleship not only easy, but possible and accessible. And so as always, don't forget, stay hybrid.